All right, here we go. We're going to next do harnessing extremes.
All righty. Good morning, everybody. Great to see you all. Great to be a part of this. All right, so let's hit forward. All right, here's our fantastic panel. Myself, I get to kick things off, give you a nice set the stage sort of situation. Then I have my colleague, Michael Mierzwa. Then we're bringing Christine on via Zoom. She had a little medical issue that precludes her traveling and joining us today. And then we have Mark Strudley.
I can change my name to Mike if you want.
Mark's close enough. We're good. So I've known Mark through his career arc, and he's now with the Pajaro Regional Flood Management Agency. Michael's with DWR. I'm with DWR, and Christine's with GEI. And we're here today to talk to you about harnessing extremes. So the flood part of FloodMar, and see how we can make the best of a challenging time. All right, so me. All right, so I'm your state climatologist. I've been doing this for about 20 years. And I've had the good fortune of having a career where I've had 3 record-setting multi-year droughts. I've had some fantastic extremes on the wet side that have included some challenges, including winter in 3 weeks in 2023, but that was not all. We decided also in 2023 to put snow on people who really don't like precip at all, but decided to show them here, look, this is what snow looks like. It's pretty cool. And then, see what, because we hadn't seen a monster snowpack in a long time. So, hey, after 40 years, let's try it again, see how we do. And we did well. It created some really cool opportunities. And so I'm going to set the stage by talking about the extremes and what we expect as the world continues to warm and things get more fun. Then I'll hand it off to Michael. We'll bring in Christine, and Mark is our cleanup hitter. And then we'll open it up to questions. All right, so I'm going to start with a little artwork. Monet's water lilies at the Orangerie. This is a really interesting time period in his life. He had cataracts. And then if you can imagine in the early 1900s having cataract surgery, which he did, and he continued to paint afterward, and this is one of the ones that he had. So this is how he was seeing the world. And I like this because it's perspective. He's seeing things from a new perspective after his surgery and still trying to convey it. And raising managed water capability in a changing climate, partnerships, new perspectives. So, all right, let's set the stage because this is really fascinating. 2013 and 2022, and maybe this year we'll find out, we started off strong. We were kicking butt. Come New Year's Eve, both 2013 and 2022 were looking like 1983. Well, that's an awesome year, right? What could possibly go wrong? Well, Mother Nature can say that's all you get. And as you see on that graphic, this is our Northern Sierra 8 Station Index, an average of 8 precip stations across the Sacramento Basin to give us a thumb rule of how wet the basin is. We see it did not go on to 83. Actually ended up short of average. Right in the middle range, in those 30-inch range of where most of our average droughts fall in. But it wasn't really average because you started so strong and then went, yeah. Now you think about that from all your water rules that are set up around Mother Nature behaving normally, right? And they say, hey, what you got in December? That means you're going to have a wet year. So we want to think about this. And then how we're working then with the roadmap for a climate resilient forecasting framework, and this comes after 2021, when a 60% snowpack was only 20% runoff. There's that, patterns aren't going to be the same anymore. Got one. So we have our roadmap, and then we're going to talk about the value of partnerships, because partnerships really help us through this adventure. All right, so a decade, if you thought the last decade of water management was challenging, the answer is yes. When the rules all work is when we're in the 40 to 60% of the historical distribution, right? Right in the middle, everything works because all the rules are built for average. We haven't found the way there too many times. And even recently, this doesn't include 25, where we did hit average, it didn't come as average, right? So Sonoma County, fantastic, had above average precip this past year. 40% of it came during 1 week in November. The seasonal annual statistics don't quite mean the same as they used to, and we have to keep that in mind. And I did note that in 2013, that was one of the motivators for Pajaro. Because there was water in December of 2012, but we got to get rid of it so that we might have a flood. We didn't, and we lost water we could have really used to navigate that drought. After a decade, we finally got the water control manual signed. We had a ceremony back in October, which was really cool. Trick is, it took a decade. We got to figure out how the partnerships can work along so we can move this along a little more expeditiously, including me, so you can get to the real interesting stuff. California has a really cool feature. We have atmospheric rivers. This is the vehicle for water coming into the state. Half our annual precip shows up this way. I show you water year 2022. Why? Because of that black one, the exceptional AR in October. Coming off the second driest year in the observed record. Whew, all right, we're off to a strong start, right? Another drought year, but the footprint of that one storm through the Sacramento Basin showed up all year. And it's these physical features that we can study, understand, and leverage that knowledge to understand how water's coming into the state. That gives us time. Time is the key ingredient. We'll get to that in a minute. So now, how do we build this framework for resilience? Well, we need a federal foundation, right? I can't expect the feds to do everything, but if they give me a foundation to work from, then we can provide state customization. And in California, we like our customization. But we need to set that up for local implementation because water is managed locally. But you get that set up in the right way. You get this fantastic set where you have an integrated observing system that allows you to understand what the state of the watershed is now. You have a forecasting environment that connects now with next with what's on the horizon. So I connect my operation to my planning and I understand what's coming. But I can have the coolest observations, and I have some really cool ones. But if I don't describe it to you, it's just going to look like artwork for you. I can forecast some really cool things like integrated vapor transport. What do you do with it? You need the decision support tools. You need to turn that cool information into analytics and tools that inform the decisions in the end that you make. And then this is the key question. What information enables resource positioning for the most successful outcomes across the landscape? As we start to understand that, then we can start feeding back, into the pieces that we want to invest in and build, and to connect those pieces and evaluate along the way. Are we making progress here? Did we find something that we weren't aware of? All part of the process, but really important. So here's our water year timeline, and you'll notice it goes more than a year. And that's really important. Because as we start the water year now here in the fall, and the fall rains start, and this year, thankfully, they started on time. We head into the heart of the wet season. Half our annual precip shows up in a 90-day window, but on average, only 21 of those days are wet. Wow, that's kind of amazing. But those are that's where the water shows up, and we want to get used to it. March, fantastic month, right? It can be the March miracle, or it can be really hot and dry, and we're going to start irrigation early, and we'll start stressing the water system even before we get to the magic vapor one. Historically, the peak of snowpack and transition from the wet season to the dry season. And a lot of laws built around the April 1 values. Well, Mother Nature's no longer obliged to hold on to that rule. That can create some wrinkles. Things we'll have to think about. Get into peak melt in April and May. Well, that gets us into the drying season as we dry out. The pace and scale of drying, how quickly those heat events set in, right? When does water demand shoot up? How we navigate that when our water demand's highest across the summer, and then now with fall we get the added joy of, hey, there might be a decaying tropical dropping in, dropping rain, maybe where you don't want it, maybe where you don't need it, maybe the complete wrong time for what you're trying to do, but you have to be aware of it. And in the end, you set an end-of-year target that helps you get ready for the next year. And that's why we put fall again there, because as you're ending one year, you're already thinking ahead. And I can tell you on April 1, if we're short and it's a dry year, everybody's question at that point is, well, what's next year going to be? Because I really need to know to help me figure out how to hedge this year. All right, so I have a lot of data, as I said. This is 2017, as my friend at Western Region Climate Center, Ben Hatchett, called it, the Subtropical Symphony. And this is really cool. So this is from December 1st to February 23rd, and these are on top, you see the precipitable water. So you see every time it goes over 20 millimeters, we qualify for an atmospheric river, and he tried to draw green lines wherever there were, and so you start seeing how the timing, pace, and scale of them go. All the little yellow dots there are the freezing elevation in the Feather River watershed. Look how dynamic that is, going from over 10,000 feet down to 2,000 feet. All right, where's the snow line? When? Right? How much is the seasonal snowpack? What's an ephemeral? How does that impact the landscape? How do we understand that? Well, you can see the gray line there is the building of the snowpack. You see there in January with that monster AR that caused a few ancillary incidents. You see the snowpack actually erode a bit. Because one thing about atmospheric rivers, a lot of moist air right near the surface. As that moisture condenses, it releases a massive amount of energy. Oddly enough, that's just the amount of energy needed to melt snow. Really kind of a neat process there. Anyway, and we go on, and you can see the Bucks Lake precip and the runoff there. So, a lot of information, right? But how do we put it together so it means something? And that's what we're after. All right, so 2022, one of the hotter years on record, but in May, we had a record cold snap. Well, how do you argue for help if that impacted you? If you have the data, right? So it's not just the annual value. Well, it was a warm year. It was one of the warmest in history. What do you mean you have a cold snap? Yes, it can happen, but if you don't have the data, it's awful hard to say it existed. This is a product our friends at Scripps put together to look at daily max and mins and when you're seeing daily extremes amidst the seasonal and annual cycle, which is pretty cool. And as you can see there in September in 2022, that was the Labor Day heat wave, where we discovered what 115 degrees looks like in town, and that really wasn't nice. Anyway, so now trying to get a little bigger picture, a partnership with USGS, in a company now called Earth Knowledge, and this is the basin characterization model, and it's a way to look at the landscape and understand it. And this is showing 77 and 2014. You say, why those 2 years? Years both had 25% of average snowpack. You can see the temperature and precip values. The precips weren't far off, but the temperatures were a lot warmer in 2014. But how does that translate to the landscape in terms of landscape stress? Well, in 2014, this is the Feather River watershed, Northern Bay area. You really see that an area that's normally wet really struggles more in the warmer environment. And this is the challenge we have to do, is understand how temperature is impacting the landscape to understand how that impacts the hydrologic cycle, because it really matters. All right, so I'm going to finish up with this slide. I sometimes call this my flux capacitor. It buys us time, right? Time's on the x-axis there. The more time we have, better decisions we can make. We get that through observation of the forecasts and putting them together with decision support. But since the rules of the game are changing, I need some good research to fuel it, right? When I do that, I can raise my managed water capability with each runoff event. As I do that, I'm getting more benefit, less hazard. A double win. The only way we're getting through this is by working together. 3 keys to that: communication, coordination, and collaboration. Those 3 really have to be at the forefront, really be on the mind. This forum is a fantastic way to do just that. So really excited. Oh, thank you. You are a gem. Much appreciated. Thank you all. All righty. So hopefully that sets the stage nice as we do a nice shot of the Southern Sierra, and you can see from the valley floor up the hills as I'm flying down to San Diego. We're already seeing the consequences of a warming world. It's not something for future generations. You're living it. It's here now. Time to work with it. Challenges only get bigger from here, so the more we get moving, better off we're going to be. Long sentence there basically says if we get things right, we'll do okay. It's going to be all right. We can get through this. And partnerships are the secret sauce. All right, so there's that atmospheric river in 2021. The low pressure was up off of Aberdeen, Washington, and it actually beat the Columbus Day hurricane in terms of low pressure. Heaviest precip went through the Golden Gate. Think about the scale of that. Absolutely fantastic. Anyway, all right, Michael.
Well, howdy, everybody. I'm Mike Mierzwa. I'm with our Division of Flood Operations. I'm a specialist, which means I get to work on a lot of different projects, one of which is actually providing local assistance to communities to develop specific emergency response plans to take advantage of flood-mar activities. What you're looking at here is a Venn diagram, and in this Venn diagram, in green, you're seeing the flood-mar. In the blue, you're seeing emergency response planning. I'm going to be really focusing on the Water Code 1242.1 opportunities out there. So there will be times where you'll be doing flood-mar, which is not in the emergency response world, and there will be things that will be happening in the emergency response world that aren't a 1242.1 process. Before I do that, to kind of get you in the theme here, I'm going to give two little quotes here, and Eric Sy will recognize one of them that I often talk about is from General Dwight Eisenhower. He said that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. So this is the leader for the Allied forces during the Second World War, and the point was, it's not what you put down, it's actually the capacity that you're building out there. The second thing out there, and this gets you in again to the sort of the emergency response world out there, is now Fred Rogers. How many of you are brave enough to? Yeah, Fred Rogers was awesome. And he said, basically, when you're scared and you're watching television, to actually focus on who are the helpers. And those are your emergency responders. These are people who you might not think are going to come out there, but when things start to actually get chaotic, they're the ones who come out there to provide assistance. And that's really the mentality that you often have in the emergency response community, is they're these helpers who will just rush in to help. Hopefully they've gone through and done some pre-activity, some planning, but they know that they're not going to necessarily follow that plan as they move. So with that in mind, some questions for us to consider is what constitutes a flood emergency? You shouldn't be going through and actually doing emergency actions unless you have an emergency. The next one is well, maybe there's some things you can do before the emergency happens, but you see indicators or signs that an emergency is coming through. So this is what constitutes a pending flood emergency. And the more you actually start moving into this emergency management and you have false alarms and things don't really happen, the less likelihood that people are going to allow you to move into that emergency space. And the emergency responders themselves will become fatigued and burned out. So it's not a hammer you want to swing often. When you do get into that emergency event or you see sure signs that one is coming through, the third question you really want to be thinking about is what can you do in a timely manner to avoid the consequences from a flood event? One of the challenges, and you can see this in some of Mike's data and graphics that he was showing out there, is that flood events, they spike up, they happen really fast. So a lot of the structural and large-scale things that we can go through and do, we don't have the ability. One that I'll bring up is when Hurricane Rita came through Harris County, Texas, shortly after Katrina had devastated New Orleans, a lot of Houstonians got into their cars and evacuated. Well, they didn't have enough capacity to actually get out of the county, and so there were more fatalities of people evacuating had instead they sheltered in place. And that is an example of, there are things you don't want to do once you actually see the sure signs of an emergency. So then the fourth step in the process here is to start thinking about what are some of the long-term solutions and some of the short-term solutions. And you want to have a mix of these. So these will roll into your plans. And then finally is what are going to be some of the ongoing problems due to residual risk. And your short-term solutions are really going to focus in on these. Residual risk in this context in the emergency response community is the risk that exists after you've taken all of the pre-mitigation activities into place. So there's always some risk that's out there. So with that in mind, getting into now floodwater diversion challenges is recognizing that you have a degree of residual risk. You really have to accept that this residual risk changes over time. It's not static. And I think everybody here agrees that. We've been talking about how we're in a new climate, a new set of water paradigm. When you're getting into your emergency response plans, the best way to start is to actually start thinking of some templates and outlines. I'm a big fan of a lot of television series. I like the murder boards from all of the criminal procedural shows. So I like to whiteboard and just put things out there and then start storing and putting them out there. And I'm going to show you some of that here. Then you get into your site-specific plans. When you're getting into floodwater diversions, it really matters where you're taking that action. You don't want to have something that's for an entire county. You want to have something that's really towards a watershed, and it can actually be a reach within the watershed that you're really focusing your activities. And then you get into the scenario-specific planning. What happens if there's too much rain? What happens if it's too much rain over a short duration? What happens if it's too much rain over a long duration? You're going to have a different response that you're going to use in those scenarios. You want to develop these triggers and thresholds not only to tell you when to start implementing your emergency plans, but also when to stand down from the emergency environment. You always want to get out of an emergency. That is not the normal operation, and your emergency responders and your options will become limited as you begin implementing them over time. So you want to find a way to get out of that as soon as possible. And then finally, if all goes well, you've been overly conservative in your emergency response planning. It'll go years, maybe decades before you implement them. You need to have some process of going through and exercising or training your emergency response plans. We do this at the state, local communities do this. I call it the fire drill. I grew up in Texas. We actually did hurricane and tornado drills. They were really gross. We had to lie down in the men's or the boys' restroom, hence the reason I don't like weather. But you know, I knew where to go. I knew where to evacuate. Okay, levee fragility. I'm going to ask everybody here, who thinks when you're doing emergency response planning that you need to plan for basically the levee holding to the very top? Not a one of you. Who here thinks you need to plan for when water first gets on the levee? I'm seeing a few brave souls. The answer is it's really kind of in between. If you had said the very top, I would say yes, and if you say the very bottom, I'm going to say yes. But these levees, they tend to hold somewhere between the top and the bottom, which I'm assuming most of you got right, or perhaps you're shy still about this. But there's a lot of uncertainty on this, and the way as engineers that we characterize the performance of levees, the levee fragility curves. And that's, you're seeing two examples here. These are some levees that I surveyed with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And in the top box there, A, and I hope you can see it there. This is, I'm going to read it off because it's only term an engineer would use out here, but this is called a backward piping erosion embankment failure. It's a mouthful. Notice there's no abbreviation or anything like that, but when two geotechnical engineers talk to each other, we know exactly how that levee failure mechanism is going to work out there. Basically, this is as the levee is loaded over time, you'll see boils come on the land side. This is the water moving through actually the under foundation for the levee through some sort of geotechnical sand lens, usually a sand layer, which existed before the layer was put there when the waterway itself was banked and braided. And as this moves, it compromises basically the foundation that levee's built on. And eventually the levee collapses and then water moves through. And you can see in this graph here, it's about when you get the water halfway up the height of the levee, for what they call the worst case situation of levees in the United States, that you now have about a 5% chance of that levee failing. When you get to the 75% loading, so if you've normalized and you're 3/4 of the way up on that levee, you now have a 25% chance. So it's not a linear response out there, but this is when the anxiety starts increasing for the emergency responders, for when we send out levee managers, the people who own the levee systems, to begin worrying on it. The bottom graph is a different failure mechanism. It's called internal erosion through embankment due to concentrated leak erosion. Again, a mouthful. That's basically, in plain speak, saying that there's a pipe that penetrates through the levee, and water is going to travel along the outside of that pipe and carry material out of it, and eventually the levee is going to cave down to where that pipe is. Happens all the time. You can see it's a very different conversation, a very different shape of curb. In this particular one, what I'm highlighting is an actual example. So this isn't like the worst case scenario. This is a levee that we inspected and went out there. As you go through and do these, you can combine the probabilities, you can see what's happening, but these would be a trigger. So if you're going through and you have a waterway and you know that you have a deficiency, you have these pipes, you can probabilistically say that, hey, the water's not really going to be reliable to the top of the levee. In this case, for both of these two failure modes, somewhere between half and 3/4 of the height of that water, that we really have some serious problems coming out here. So these are the types of things that you want to consider when you're getting into your emergency response plans. Where you can get some data to find out when you're going to have this potential for flooding out here. The first graph that's sitting on your left is from the California Nevada River Forecast Center. These are what they call their official forecast points. There's 102 of them. These green dots, when they turn yellow and red, Mike and I have a lot of people who get really anxious at the state about this, and some of them are okay when they're in the yellow, even in the red or purple stage, but there's data sets there. Unfortunately, these are for the main stem rivers, and you can see that there's a sort of a gap of data sitting in the San Joaquin Valley out there, that we don't have a lot of these official forecast points. So it's nice that we can see in advance when something's happening out there, but this realistically is not going to be useful for most of the areas where we really want to go through and divert flood water into our groundwater basins. In the middle graphic, that's also from the California Nevada River Forecast Center. You're looking at 181 other points out there, and the Weather Service is continually adding these points. When I was doing forecasting, I think it was around 90 forecast points and 0 other points that we had access to at the time. You can develop relationships to move these from sort of that white map to the color code, rainbow, green, yellow, red, purple, on the left there, by having conversations and knowing historically where the flood events have occurred. But you're still limited, 102 now to an additional about 200. And I'm thinking most of you have been looking, I want to use the stuff on the right, where we have all of these blue dots. And Emily showed this to us today. She had text saying that she was looking at and using information from the California Data Exchange Center. And you can find, these aren't just precipitation stations, but they're quite a bit of real-time precipitation stations, where you might not use a forecast, but you can see basically the rate of rise, either on an hourly and incremental incidence scale, usually reported on a 15-minute basis, or on a daily cumulative total, or you can start looking at month-long statistics. In the emergency response world, you're going to want that smaller time frame. There's another map out here that we don't have access to, and this is the data that the counties have that they're not providing us. When I was working back in July with San Bernardino County, they have their own camera systems, their own rain gauges, their own forecast systems that aren't uploaded onto the California Data Exchange Center yet. So we're constantly adding data there. So when you start getting into looking at, hey, I have some areas where I know there's a probability of failure, I have now the ability to get some triggers, you want to start thinking about, well, maybe I can make an emergency diversion plan. We recognize this back when we had the executive order in 1625. There was another executive order in 23, and then there's the SB 122 and the Water Code 1242.1. Unfortunately, I wasn't in the room where it happened when they were writing these. Specifically, the Water Code calls for 2 types of plans to be implemented. The first is a general plan, and the second is a local plan of flood control. And I do want you to understand why I really don't feel those are the appropriate mechanisms for this. They're good planning mechanisms, but not for diversions. A general plan element is really about land use. This is looking into the future where you want to actually grow or change the land use out there or designate it. They definitely play a role, but in practice, most communities do not update their flood hazards or their safety elements in their general plans. They really only do the housing element because there's state and federal money that comes, carrots attached with doing that. And they're led by Lucy, the Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation, used to be the Office of Planning and Research. The staff there do work with us at the department. They're very open to this, but they weren't consulted on the general plans. They didn't realize that they were getting into the emergency response community. The second one are these local plans of flood control. They sound like a really good name. They're limited to the Central Valley for urban communities only. Most of the places where we really want to go through and have recharge is not in an apartment complex, not in a hospital, not in a prison, and not in a school. It's probably in a former agricultural area or some sort of fallowed area. These are going to be in the rural landscape in most cases. In these urban plans of flood control, they're technically submitted by communities to have a 200-year level of protection to the flood board, but I promise you there is nobody from the state who is reviewing and commenting on these plans. There's no process for audit or transparency. So there's other things that we could go through and do. And those are to come up with some sort of general emergency flood diversion plan. I'm not going to read through all of the steps here, but I wanted to highlight number 9, as you're working through the elements that you want to have an emergency plan, is you want to go through and describe what are your flood diversion triggers, both what would be the conditions when you would begin moving into the emergency response and the conditions when you would start backing down. It's going to be like 24 hours or 48 hours. And this is my last slide. I'm working with Vanessa Nishikawa at Stantec. She's helping us. There's a typo here. It's the 1242.1, not 41.2. But in this flow chart, this is kind of walking through the process of at the start where you would have your plans, and then when you would start getting into decisions, can I start exercising my plans, is what we're trying to help communities understand where to go. And the idea is that you could go back to the template that we had of what an outline of a plan might look like, and in parallel start thinking about, if I have an opportunity to move into an emergency diversion, what other checkboxes do I need to have? To the executive order the governor had, you don't have to have the emergency plan actually adopted or prepared to get in there. Doesn't mean you shouldn't go through and sketch some notes down of what you might want to do this winter, this fall, in preparation for some of the high water coming. That's really all I had out there. If you have questions, you can reach me. I am here to help communities and develop these plans, work you through the triggers, give you language. I can't regulate what you come up with a plan, but I can I can strongly recommend what you might do. If you can't reach a hold of me, you can go through and use the recharge@water.ca.gov email. Erica, you're pretty much monitoring that, I'm assuming, right? And if I'm not responding, she's going to get a hold of me like super fast. We really do want to see people starting to document basically where these opportunities exist. Thank you.
All right, now we're gonna. All right, now we're gonna bring in Christine. Christine, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Kind of.
How about now?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes. All righty, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christine Gutierrez. I'm with GEI Consultants, and I'm here today to present some tools to help expedite these flood diversions that we've all been talking about. So with that, I'm going to present the Central Valley Flood MAR dashboard today. And before I dive into the presentation, I do want to just say a few thanks to some people that may be listening in or in the room today. So big thanks to Jenny Moore, who has spearheaded this with DWR, and our GEI team, of course, who spent countless hours developing the dashboard and helping to implement it. And then lastly, of course, our local agencies who have contributed a lot of data and information that's necessary to make the dashboard successful. So with that, I am going to be providing an overview of the dashboard and its features, as well as provide some information on our beta testing period. And I will be sharing the link at the end of the presentation. So get ready to take a picture of that if you're interested in touring the dashboard for yourself. So jumping right into an overview of the dashboard, our initial concept for the dashboard did come out of Water Code 1242.1, particularly the requirement for public notification. As many of you know, following early diversions in 2023 and this subsequent Water Code implementation, it was recognized that there was a need for system-wide coordination, needed to maximize potential recharge, essentially letting diverters know when and where they can divert and which agencies are responsible for providing that notification. So with that, DWR developed a dashboard for the San Joaquin River system, and we eventually expanded that to include the Sacramento River system to essentially assist agencies with that diversion notification. So to assist with these diversions, the dashboard was created with two primary functions. Function one being an integrated flood forecasting tool for agencies and diverters to facilitate these groundwater diversions, and function two being an overarching resource for all things flood management and emergency operations. And we'll get into how each of these functions are carried out in the dashboard during today's presentation. So to carry out these functionalities, we identified several goals for basically information and data we wanted to include in the dashboard. So a couple of those goals include identifying flood agencies, their associated flood thresholds, such as Water Code 1242.1 flood flows, or other EO directives or established flood thresholds that the agency may have. We also wanted to provide a secondary means of diversion notification. Something that we heard early on was while they have listservs and they were trying to get the information out, that there were flood flows that were eligible for diversion without a permit. It was hard to get the word out. So we wanted to create that capability for the agencies. We also want to identify where eligible flood conditions may be occurring, provide flood forecasting capabilities, and flood management and groundwater recharge resources. So with this information, the overarching goal of the dashboard will be for local agencies to utilize the tools and resources to help facilitate these diversions and also implement their flood operations. So getting into the features. So there are two primary ways that flood conditions can be displayed in the dashboard. The first being cross sections, which are our main resource or indicator in the dashboard to help facilitate these diversions. So each cross section, or the goal of each cross section actually, is to have them populated with local flood management information that we collect through our outreach efforts. So as you can see on the screen here, this is a cross section from the San Joaquin River. And we do have some agency information already populated on this. We have been working a little bit with Lower San Joaquin Levee District, who has provided some information on their jurisdictional authority, so local flood threshold points, as well as some planning documentation. So that can all be accessed through the cross section itself. So our goal again is to populate every cross section within the dashboard with this type of information. The cross-section itself also shows current elevation for each cross-section, which is calculated based on the flow from the nearest CDEC gauge, and the latest LIDAR data from the CV-Fed model, which is a separate but parallel project that we're pulling data from. So we still have a lot of information that we would like to include in the dashboard, and as you'll see as you tour it for yourself, there are a lot of data gaps in this. Basically, a lot of the flood information when it comes to operations is not public information. So as we continue to do presentations like this or reach out to individual agencies, we are asking that you submit local flood information. And as that is submitted, we will be populating these cross sections. So the second way flood conditions are presented in the dashboard are through local flood threshold points. And these points are typically utilized where cross-section data gaps are present. For the most part, data gaps are a result of inadequate LIDAR data, particularly due to subsidence. This is particularly true for the upper portion of the San Joaquin River system, but you'll also see we do have a gap in cross sections between the Sacramento River system and the San Joaquin River system where we just don't have that data available yet. There are conversations about obtaining that information, but until then we will use local flood threshold points, which operate the same as cross sections. You just don't have an elevation profile, but all the flood information will be present on those points. So in summary, both cross sections and the local flood threshold points are used to visually indicate diversion eligibility, but they are solely reliant on agency public notification. So basically when an agency submits proof of public notification, which can be done through the dashboard itself, we can activate a reach or multiple reaches within the dashboard and to visually represent where flood conditions are occurring. And this is shown by the yellow lit up area on the screen here. So similar to what Water Code 1242.1 requires, we require that public notification proof is submitted with that request. And we ask that you identify your diversion source, the time period, and the area where you're diverting. And if you don't know this information, like such as the mile point, you can click on various cross sections throughout the system to indicate where those diversions are eligible. So additionally, the second function of the dashboard is to truly serve as a database for all things flood operation and management. Our goal was to essentially create a one-stop shop for regional flood management and operations data. So what we did is we compiled various data sources from the federal, state, and local level to really provide a comprehensive database to minimize the amount of resources that local agencies and diverters have to source for themselves. So some of those data sets that we have included include groundwater recharge suitability, which is shown on the screen here with the UC Davis SAGB layer. We also have FEMA flood zones, locations of diversion points, equipment and material resource locations, so for like land clearing and pump rental locations. And of course, we have contact information for pertinent flood agencies. And there's a ton more information within the dashboard. But always, as we continue to build out this dashboard, we are open to securing even more data, whatever you think would be necessary and or helpful for all things flood operations and management. Okay, and lastly, we are doing a beta testing period. Technically, we are not starting our beta testing until December 1st of this year, but all of you who are attending today get a little quick early access to the dashboard itself. So here on the screen, feel free to take a picture. This is our dashboard currently. We will be releasing it more publicly on December 1st, but in the meantime, feel free to visit the dashboard, test out the functionalities, kind of explore the different data sets. And we are asking for any feedback is welcome. Essentially, we want to include local flood thresholds, additional / updated data sets if it's available, and any feedback on functionality improvement. We are in a beta testing period, so there will be some kinks to work out. There is, data that needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. So feel free to test it out, and comments may be submitted to our email address, which is cv-help@geiconsultants.com. Or you can actually email us through our dashboard. So if you go into the dashboard, click on the map viewer, we have a contact us feature where you can email directly through the dashboard, which I highly encourage as it does help us test out our functionalities. So with that, we are really excited to share the dashboard itself. And if you have any questions, we will be answering those shortly. And with that, I'll kick it back to the panel.
All right, Mark.
All right, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me here. I want to share a story, a slice of the Pajaro story, and it's quite different, I think, from what we've all been talking about a lot so far, which are these 1242.1 type on-farm diversions. This panel is talking about managing extremes, and the way in which we are managing extremes is through a large flood risk reduction project. And so some of you have seen me talk before at FMA or other places, and so yes, there's going to be some recycled slides here, but the intent here is to tease out just a little slice of this very interesting story on Pajaro and what we're doing. I'm not going to touch on the story about how we resurrected this legacy project that was dead and brought it back to life. Marie Grimm is going to talk later today about some of the unique aspects of how we funded this project and how we fund our work. I want to talk about what's going on here. Okay. So I want to talk about how we're expanding floodplain reconnection for managed aquifer recharge. So this is like a passive recharge type application. So first, what I'm showing you here is kind of where we live in the world. For those of you not familiar with Pajaro, it's on the Central Coast. It's a river system that feeds into the Monterey Bay. It's about 1,300 square miles, so not huge, but pretty decent size. We manage the lower part of the watershed for flood risk reduction in the Santa Cruz and Monterey County area. This map here shows in colors all the different features that the Army Corps is going to introduce to this system. So the history, very briefly, is that the Army Corps built levees in the 1940s. They did not perform well. We've been waffling in planning since 1966 with them, but finally we're at a turning point now where we're done with planning. We're designing reaches, and we're actually going to construction on one of the first segments or reaches of the project any day now, literally. Granite Construction got the contract award. We're just waiting for the submittals any day. What's unique about this project is, and the part of the story I want to tell you is how we're threading the needle, how we're taking a single-purpose flood risk management authorization by Congress from 1966 and injecting an aspect of managed aquifer recharge into the multi-benefit picture. And this is, to Mike's comment, this is about relationships and cooperation, because it wouldn't be without the cooperation of folks at the Army Corps, folks at DWR, in funding this project and funding various aspects of this project that helps us understand where we need to go. So the basic premise here is that in areas of agriculture, we're going to be setting the levees back. We're going to be demolishing the existing levees, which, by the way, only protect right now against roughly the 8-year recurrence interval event. So the original design was a 50-year recurrence interval protection. That did not turn out to be the case. We have roughly 8-year recurrence interval protection, so it's barely better than having no levees at all. If you think about a typical bankfull discharge recurrence interval for the stream, we're going to be setting these levees back generically by 100 feet on either side. So it's not a huge margin, but it's a decent improvement over what we have currently. There are other parts of the system where we're doing much larger setbacks. So there's one spot in particular, and I have accessory slides that I can hobnob about either in Q&A or separately with you if you want, but there's up to several hundred to 1,000 feet of setback. So there's a couple of places where we have really huge opportunities to expand the capacity of the floodplain. So the question is, how are we doing this with the Corps? So this is a picture of part of what's called Reach 6. So this is the first reach or segment of the project that's going to get built. Those dark red features are going to be the new levees. This part of the system actually does not have any levees currently. So these are going to be new levees that are introduced. And then the light pink areas are these setback areas that are going to form this off-channel or terraced kind of habitat features, and they're also going to be excavated. So the way the Army Corps helped us thread the needle is they worked with us through what's called their Engineering with Nature program, where they're trying to develop approaches to their bread and butter, which is building levees or other types of flood infrastructure, and introducing techniques or other features that are more consistent with the natural capacity of systems to respond to pressures like flooding. And so what we're doing in specific locations is we're setting the levees back, and through their Engineering with Nature program, they're actually designing features in these levee setback areas that will be excavated. And the way we're threading that single purpose flood risk management authority, because we couldn't strictly fund habitat or aquifer recharge features in a project authority like this, is these areas are being used as borrow. So it's all being viewed as a cost-saving measure through the introduction of borrow material that will be used in part to build the new levees. So that's the way the Army Corps has been very helpful with us in kind of threading this needle and looking expansively through that federal framework that Mike Anderson was talking about. This is the framework of the ability of it to introduce a project like this. The trick, though, has been in doing that, what kind of benefit are we really providing? So a lot of the conversations today and yesterday have been about trying to, when they're talking about kind of more I guess, generalistic behavioral modeling or very discrete first principles modeling of the groundwater system and what recharge might bring. We're doing kind of the same thing here where we're scratching our heads about, look, we think this is going to introduce managed aquifer recharge benefit to the area, but what is it going to introduce? And to set context of that, and again, to hearken on this partnership issue, is we are very close partners with the Water Management Agency and the GSA in this area, which is the Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency. And they have never included these types of off-channel recharge opportunities in their portfolio of getting to groundwater sustainability because the Army Corps project had waffled for many decades and never really was a real thing. Well, now it's a real thing. So now we are working together with them to try to quantify what these benefits to recharge would bring. And that's where help from Catherine and folks from the Coastal Watershed Flood Risk Reduction Grant Program at DWR, even our subventions authorization with DWR, and then also technical assistance from Jenny Marr and the FloodMar group. They have lent financial resources to this project outside of the project scope and authority to help us answer these questions. And it's been done through things like EcoFIP. So Michael Founds was involved with us in our EcoFIP analysis, where we're trying to take some modeling estimations of if you excavate these inset floodplains by X amount, how much more inundation days are you going to get inside these setback levees, and then what does that portend for recharge? And that becomes a very complicated question for all the things we've been talking about, all these this very discrete, complicated, site-specific subsurface architecture of the floodplain. And so some of that has been funneled through this EcoFIP work. Some of it has also been funneled through a grant that local research academia has gotten through a UCOP grant. So Andy Fisher has been mentioned a couple times from UCSC. He's spearheading this effort with us. There's been TTEM out here done in part by him, also in part by Catherine's group, to kind of supplement data out here to help us understand what these recharge opportunities are, where they exist, and how likely successful are they going to be. And I wanted to end really quickly and keep us on time. I know I'm skimming over a lot of details, and there's a lot of story to tell with this project, but I want to end here by talking about AB 876. Some of you may know about this. Many of you, I think, probably don't. But AB 876 gives this project a CEQA exemption and state permitting exemptions. It also gives not just the Army Corps project. So if I go backwards, apologize. If I go backwards to this image, you will note down in the bottom left that north-south trending feature is Highway 1. This project has features upstream of Highway 1. But even though there are levees downstream of Highway 1, the Army Corps is not improving those levees. And there are also gaps upstream where there are existing levees that were built in the 40s that are not being upgraded. The short story of a very long, complicated story to that is that they were not economically justified by the benefit cost ratio process that the Army Corps goes through in racking and stacking projects like this. But what AB 876 does is it gives us a CEQA and state permitting pass, not just for what the Army Corps is doing, and strictly they don't need it because they have federal supremacy, but it gives us a CEQA and state permitting pass for other bolt-on projects that we are doing at PERFMA to complete the whole portfolio of updating the system. So we have a Pajaro Bridge to Bay project going from Highway 1 bridge down to the ocean. We're working with AMBAG to update the Highway 1 bridge itself over the Pajaro River. And we have other bolt-on projects through various state and federal grants that this gives us coverage for. And the reason it gives us coverage is because the provisions of the bill harken back to the engineering with nature approach and the EcoFIP type analysis that is driving project features and design. So we only get this pass if we can prove that we are taking an engineering with nature type approach. It doesn't have to be with the Army Corps under that program, but it has to be a program like that, and we have to do analysis that speaks to incorporating habitat and groundwater recharge enhancements to the project, which is what we're doing, and we all know that's the only way you get funding anyway, so this is kind of a foregone conclusion, but we are committed to doing something, which is obviously much better than doing nothing and leaving this system alone. So AB 876, I think, sets the stage potentially for a lot of us. I share this with the intent of starting conversations with you all. If you're curious about how we made this work, I'm happy to talk to you. I think more of this streamlining needs to be done. It's not just about streamlining permitting and regulatory process itself. It's about pushing it aside when we're doing good things so we can get things done in this state, which we all know, I think, is one of the hardest states to get things done, just because of how much we all care, to be quite honest, about what we're doing. We do need to get things done. And so this is a way we've been able to get things done. This has carved years off the project implementation timeframe. So I'll end with that. Happy to answer any questions if we have time or afterwards. Thanks.
All right, I know we're cutting it kind of close, but I think we have time for a few questions. So microphone folks, I'll let you.
We have 4 minutes.
All right.
Although we're also watching how quickly lunch is getting set up. So.
Well, we can customize.
Real,
I guess I'm hungry. But go ahead. Let's have a question.
We got 4 minutes now.
one quick question for Mike Mierzwa and the dashboard team. One of the requirements in 1242.1 was delta conditions. My question is whether those were integrated into the dashboard.
I don't know if this is, oh, it is obviously on. I didn't know if Christina also, they are in the dashboard. I'm just going to say I'm pretty sure they're in the dashboard, but she did have a screen. I don't know, Mike, if you could go all the way back to Christina's presentation. It might have been zoomed, actually. But yeah, she has the ability to do it, and it's in the flowchart process where we get in there too. For the delta conditions, there's going to be delta conditions for the San Joaquin Basin and a separate set of delta conditions for the Sacramento Basin. But one thing I wanted to just opine on a little bit out there is it takes travel time to go through and have water from the southernmost reaches of the San Joaquin Basin to actually get into the delta and influence things. And yet the delta conditions are based off of a day flow model that's produced on a daily basis. Everyone might not know that. I know you're aware of it. And the projects are operating each day as that changes. I've been advocating that there needs to be a zone of influence where basically the area that's near the delta that can affect it in that day should maybe be restricted by the delta conditions, but when you get further afield, that shouldn't be the case. And we'd have to go through and do an analysis to show under flood conditions what that travel time is. But to put it into context, it's about 2 to 3 days for water from Orville to really reach down into the delta on the Feather River system. It's, 3 to 5 days for Shasta to get down there. Folsom's about a day. And then when you get it off of the Stanislaus, that's about a 3-day process. Anything beyond that is going to be really kind of, if you're only diverting for 24 or 48 hours, it's going to be a blip before you have the opportunity to release water upstream to reestablish that protection for the water rights holders.
Hey, is this working? Hi, I'm John. Thank you for the presentations. They're all great. Mike Mierzwa, the answer is 3 feet on the levee, freeboard. I thought you knew that, but you didn't tell anybody. The other thing you're talking about is concentration time off these floods, and that's critical to this whole water rights business that we're in. But I will just state one of those old cliches: surface water is fast, groundwater is slow. These storm hydrographs come off very rapidly, and the MAR tool is great, but we did an analysis of the dry creek above Modesto. Every county has a dry creek in California. And that one is the largest uncontrolled, unregulated watershed in the San Joaquin Valley. We looked at, well, what could we do to capture these flash flows that develop? Mike, you would know how to predict them. And the volumes we could generate, unless you build what I laughingly call Lambie Lake at the top, which you're talking about a trivial volume. You're not, the flood peak has tens of thousands of acre feet in it, and you might be able to hold 1,000 on a reasonably sized project. So one has to have a reality check on what are we really, one man's flood mar is another man's flood. I think of this process, and I wonder if you do, in terms of what can I hold in these regulating reservoirs that I can then subsequently release. And that's what FIRO's all about, is how do you change the rule curve. But this idea, just so everyone knows, of catchers mitting a flood storm, you need to do Mark's project. You need to really use the floodplain itself. These basins we might put it on, or farms we might put it on, they just can't hold it. They just can't hold it. So I look for your comments, Mike Anderson, on the hydrology of what's coming and what AI can do to tell you what's in the storm. And Mike, what you would say about that comment I've made, if you will, on volume of the flood flow versus the volume of the recharge facility, be it a farm or a basin.
Okay, I'll start and then I'll hand off. So as far as understanding timing, this is where we talk about the observations, understanding now what the watershed is, how wet does it have to get before it responds. We find in our West Slope Sierra watersheds, particularly here at this time of year, hey, rain and wow, that's really cool. It rained an inch and nothing happened, right? And then all of a sudden we get a rain and boom, there it is. If we have the observations that help us understand, we're getting close, right? We're getting close. Understanding then the timing of when it's going to come up. You can't wait till it comes up to do something, or the flood's gone by before you get any of the equipment even close to doing anything. So understanding the time to be able to move resources, get things ready, be ready to turn on, turn off, and know, again, I think Michael had it, going in and getting out. Having that information in the forecast, understanding that timing, also understanding there's this storm, but when's the next one, right? The time between storms actually becomes a really valuable construct, particularly when you're talking about introducing flexibility into the larger regulating reservoirs. And understanding the larger regulating reservoirs have to accommodate the unregulated. And just as a note of how crazy 2023 was, on the Kings River, it's Mill Creek, the unregulated tributary coming in below Pine Flat. In March of 2023, it had a peak flow of 11,500 CFS. You say, well, that's a fair bit of water. It is, because the lower Kings River only holds 9,000. So we're moving into a world where our dry creeks can actually consume the full lower river channel, given that sense of just how much water is in our future and understanding what we're trying to manage.
On the levee side, first on the 3-foot freeboard, that is definitely the requirement for Army Corps levees, but it might surprise people. California has 5,000 miles of non-Army Corps levees, so we're the largest portfolio holder of levees in the United States of America, and if you take states 2, 3, and 4, they're just barely exceeding us. Which is why the Army Corps is out here and we're doing these inspections now in these non-Army Corps sections, and it's the Wild West. There's often no freeboard out there. Even the Army Corps systems, as they get deficient, the levees slough or basically compress over time, so the freeboard is often lost in a lot of the systems. So that 3-foot does not make any engineer comfortable at all. But getting to the question really is, I'm going to kind of pose another question out there. Who pays when there's flood loss? Be it an agricultural field that's lost and it can't get into production soon enough. I'll give an example is a lot of farmers will go through and start disking and drying their fields in March and April in preparation for their seed when we start getting into the dry season, when they can do their irrigated agriculture later on. But if they lose the opportunity to dry the fields, there is a loss of one of their crop rotations. I know this is the case in Yolo County out here. Who pays for that? Well, the answer is the landowner pays for this, the farmer, right? They're not getting the production out of it. The community that would then have the tax revenue generated from all the economic activity associated with that production that crop loses, and then whatever emergency response recovery costs are put out there. And those are paid for by us, taxpayers, at the federal level or the state level to come out, not just in the response, but in the recovery. When you're in a levee system and you have a loading on the levee system, there's damage. The minute I started showing those curves that you're at that, and this is your point about the freeboard, but when you have the 5, the 10, the 15, 25% of that height on that levee, even though the water hasn't propagated through on that piping erosion that I showed, or hasn't moved through that pipe, that physical pathway out there, it's moving particles. And so each time you load a levee, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker. The levee system owners have to go through and maintain these levees, repair and rebuild them. That's a cost to them. And basically those fragility curves do technically degrade over time. And what the long-term intent is to go through and periodically do an inspection of these non-core systems to basically assess how that risk has changed over time. But each of those systems does put some cost out there, but there's no mechanism. We're protecting the water rights holders, but we're not actually coming up with a mechanism to show when you're surcharging a waterway, who is paying for all of these flood loss costs. They're out there. And so with that in mind, absolutely I agree that it's in the interest to go through and facilitate basically some of these emergency diversions. And the main question you had out there is are the little diversions really going to have a big reduction in the water supply? And I don't think so at all. We did go through and do diversions twice last year on the Casunas River to the southeast of here near Elk Grove, and there were some diversions up in Dunnigan. And we didn't really see big drops, but the process the Water Board has where we go through and put what those diversions are, we have a quantity, a volume of water that's been removed from the system. We need to go back, and it's probably on the department, to go back and do an analysis to show, did we really reduce the water levels such that somebody else on the water supply side was unable to take advantage of that water as it moved further downstream. And in practice, I don't think that's the case. When we've been talking again to landowners under these winter conditions, a lot of the places you want to put the recharge, it's already wet. So there's also going to be a real limit on where practically you can, under a 2-day diversion period, put the water. You can stack it, but yeah, I don't think it's going to be a big challenge over time. It's just about kind of telling that story.
All righty, I got the look that said, hey, this is an awesome panel, but time's done. So thank you all for your attention. Thank you all to our panel members. And